The silence in Romano's fine jewelry was deafening. 5 minutes earlier, I had walked through those mahogany doors clutching my grandmother's ring, prepared to finally get answers about the piece of jewelry that had been the source of endless family ridicule for 8 long years. The elderly jeweler, Mr. Anthony Romano, had taken one look at the worn band with its cloudy stone and smiled politely, the kind of smile reserved for customers bringing in obvious costume pieces. But now, as he peered through his high-powered magnifying loupe, that polite smile had vanished entirely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. His weathered hands began to tremble, and when he finally looked up at me, his eyes held something I'd never seen directed at me before in connection with this ring. Respect. Pure, unadulterated respect. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the classical music playing softly in the background. "I need to ask you something very important. Where exactly did you acquire this piece?" The question hit me like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because of the reverence in his tone. For 8 years, every person who had laid eyes on this ring had asked similar questions, but always with barely concealed laughter. "Where did you find that thing? Surely you're not planning to wear that old trinket to the wedding? Don't you think it's time to upgrade to something more suitable?" But Mr. Romano's question carried weight, anticipation, and something that made my heart race in a way I couldn't quite understand. "My name is Catherine Hayes, though everyone in my husband's family has always called me Kathy, like I'm still the small-town girl who stumbled into their sophisticated Boston social circle 8 years ago. I suppose, in many ways, that's exactly what I am. When I married Jonathan Hayes, I thought I was getting a fairy tale ending. Jonathan was everything my mother had dreamed of for me. Charming, educated, successful, and from a family whose name appeared on hospital wings and university buildings throughout New England. What I didn't realize was that marrying into the Hayes family meant I was also signing up for a lifetime of subtle corrections, gentle suggestions, and well-meaning advice about how to properly fit into a world I had never been groomed for. The ring that now sat on Mr. Romano's velvet examination pad had belonged to my grandmother, Elena Kowalski, a woman whose story I was only beginning to understand as an adult. Elena had arrived in America in 1952 with nothing but the clothes on her back, a small suitcase, and this ring, which she wore every single day until her death when I was 16. She had fled post-war Eastern Europe under circumstances she never fully explained, settling in the small industrial town of Millbrook, Ohio, where she worked double shifts at the local textile factory while learning English at night school. By the time I was old enough to ask meaningful questions about her past, dementia had already begun stealing her memories, leaving me with fragments of stories told in a mixture of broken English and the Polish she sometimes reverted to when emotions overwhelmed her. What I did know was that Elena had raised 5 children as a single mother after my grandfather was killed in an industrial accident when my father was only 12. She had put all 5 of those children through high school, and 3 of them through college, including my father, who became the first person in our family to earn a professional degree. She had done all of this while wearing that same ring every single day, the ring that the Hayes family had spent nearly a decade quietly mocking. The mockery hadn't started immediately. During our engagement, Jonathan's mother, Margaret Hayes, had been diplomatically silent about my choice to wear my grandmother's ring, rather than accepting one of the family heirlooms she had so graciously offered. Margaret was the type of woman who could express disapproval through the arch of an eyebrow or the pause before a compliment, and she had perfected these subtle arts over decades of Boston society leadership. Jonathan's sister Victoria was less subtle. Victoria had inherited her mother's sense of style and her father's directness, creating a combination that could slice through pretense like a blade through silk. "It's very unique," Victoria had said during our engagement party, holding my hand up to examine the ring as if it were a curious artifact. "So wonderfully vintage. Almost antique, really. Where did you say it came from?" I had explained about Elena, about the ring being the only thing of value she had brought from the old country, about how she had never taken it off in all the years I had known her. Victoria had nodded with what I thought was understanding, but I later learned was actually the kind of polite attention one gives to quaint family stories that explain but don't excuse poor taste. The real criticism had begun after the wedding, once I was officially part of the family, and therefore subject to their improvement efforts. It started with suggestions about jewelry suitable for various occasions. Margaret would mention how certain vintage pieces could be wonderfully reset with more contemporary stones. Victoria would share articles about jewelry trends, or casually mention estate sales where marvelous old settings could be found. Jonathan, caught between his family's expectations and his genuine affection for me, tried to navigate the middle ground by suggesting that perhaps we could have Elena's ring cleaned or evaluated, just to see if there was anything that could be done to enhance its natural beauty. I had resisted these suggestions for years, not out of stubbornness, but out of loyalty to the woman who had shaped so much of my understanding of resilience and dignity. Elena had worn this ring through poverty, tragedy, triumph, and loss. It had been on her finger when she worked those double shifts, when she attended my father's college graduation, when she taught me to make pierogi in her tiny kitchen, and when she held my hand during her final days in the nursing home. Replacing it or altering it felt like betraying not just her memory, but the values she had tried to instill in me about finding worth in substance rather than appearance. But 8 years of gentle pressure, subtle comments, and well-meaning suggestions had worn down my resolve in ways I was only beginning to understand. I had started removing the ring for important family functions, telling myself it was just easier to avoid the comments. I had begun deflecting questions about it, with self-deprecating jokes about my quirky vintage style. I had even caught myself looking at other women's jewelry with something approaching shame, wondering what it would feel like. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To wear something that commanded automatic respect rather than polite tolerance. The breaking point had come 3 weeks earlier at Victoria's annual charity luncheon for the Boston Children's Hospital. It was the kind of event where appearances mattered enormously, where the right jewelry could signal your place in the social hierarchy as clearly as a name tag. I had chosen my outfit carefully. A navy dress that Margaret had helped me select, paired with pearl earrings that had been Jonathan's wedding gift to me. But I had also worn Elena's ring, as I did every day, because removing it felt like removing a part of myself. The luncheon had been proceeding normally until Victoria's friend, Caroline Westbrook, had noticed my ring during the silent auction. Caroline was the kind of woman who collected both jewelry and gossip with equal enthusiasm, and she had quite literally gasped when she saw Elena's ring on my finger. "Oh my goodness, Kathy," she had exclaimed loud enough to draw attention from nearby tables. "What an interesting piece. It's so unusual. Almost primitive, really. Is it some kind of folk jewelry?" The question had been asked with genuine curiosity rather than malice, but the effect was the same. Suddenly, every woman at our table was examining my ring, and I could see the mixture of confusion and carefully concealed amusement in their expressions. These were women who wore Cartier and Tiffany, who inherited pieces from Bulgari and Van Cleef and Arpels. To them, Elena's ring wasn't just unfashionable, it was incomprehensible. Victoria, perhaps trying to rescue me from further embarrassment, had quickly changed the subject, but the damage was done. For the rest of the luncheon, I had felt hyper-aware of my hands, constantly adjusting my position to hide the ring, wondering how many other social situations I had navigated, while unknowingly broadcasting my outsider status through this single piece of jewelry. That night, Jonathan had found me sitting on our bedroom floor, holding the ring and crying in a way I hadn't cried since Elena's funeral. He had sat beside me, pulling me close, and for a moment I thought he might finally understand the impossible position his family's attitudes had put me in. Instead, he had suggested, as gently as possible, that perhaps it was time to consider having the ring reset, or perhaps commissioning a replica that could be worn for every day, while keeping Elena's original safe. "It's not about the ring, Kathy," he had said, stroking my hair. "It's about you feeling comfortable and confident. If the ring is causing you stress, maybe there's a way to honor Elena's memory, while also helping you feel more at ease in social situations." His words had been kind, well-intentioned, and completely missing the point. The ring wasn't causing me stress. The constant judgment and subtle pressure to change who I was, that was causing me stress. But I hadn't known how to explain that without sounding defensive or unreasonable, so I had simply nodded and promised to think about his suggestion. For 3 weeks, I had thought about little else. I had researched jewelry designers who specialized in resetting vintage pieces. I had looked at contemporary rings that might serve as suitable replacements. I had even gone so far as to make an appointment with a local jeweler to discuss options. But every time I imagined taking Elena's ring off my finger permanently, I felt like I was losing something essential about myself, something I couldn't afford to lose. That's what had brought me to Romano's Fine Jewelry on this particular Tuesday afternoon. I hadn't come to have the ring reset or replaced. I had come to finally learn its true story, to understand what Elena had actually left me, and to arm myself with knowledge that might help me defend my choice to keep wearing it. If I was going to continue being the family embarrassment, I wanted to at least understand why. Mr. Romano had been recommended by a colleague at the elementary school where I taught 3rd grade. Mrs. Patterson, who had been teaching for 37 years, had mentioned that her late husband had been a collector of estate jewelry, and that Romano was the only jeweler in Boston who truly understood pieces with historical significance. He doesn't just look at the gold and stones, she had told me. He looks at the story. That was exactly what I needed, someone who could help me understand Elena's story, and by extension, my own. So I had made the appointment, taken a personal day from school, and walked into Romano's Fine Jewelry with Elena's ring, and a heart full of hope that I might finally find someone who could see its value, even if that value was purely sentimental. Now, watching Mr. Romano's hands tremble as he examined the ring under increasingly powerful magnification, I realized that the value might not be purely sentimental after all. His reaction was unlike anything I had ever witnessed in connection with this piece of jewelry. He wasn't looking at it with the polite tolerance I had grown accustomed to, or even with the curiosity that Caroline Westbrook had shown. He was looking at it with something approaching awe. "Mrs. Hayes," he said finally, setting down his loupe and meeting my eyes directly. "I need to ask you to be very patient with me while I conduct some preliminary tests. What you've brought me today is not at all what I expected when you made this appointment." His words sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't have said whether it was from excitement or fear. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Romano stood and walked to a cabinet behind his counter, retrieving several small instruments I didn't recognize. "I mean that this ring, which you described over the phone as a simple family piece you wanted evaluated for sentimental reasons, appears to be something quite extraordinary. The setting is platinum, not silver as it appears, and the oxidation patterns suggest significant age. The stone." He paused, looking at me carefully. "Mrs. Hayes, have you ever had this piece professionally evaluated?" I shook my head, suddenly feeling foolish for never having thought to do so. "No, never. My grandmother always just called it her ring. She never spoke about its value or where it came from originally. Should I have had it looked at before now?" Mr. Romano's expression softened. "There's no should have, Mrs. Hayes. People inherit pieces all the time without knowing their history, but I'm going to suggest that we take this very slowly and very carefully. If my preliminary assessment is correct, you may be wearing something far more significant than anyone realized." The weight of his words settled over me like a blanket, warm and overwhelming at the same time. For 8 years I had defended this ring based purely on its emotional significance, never imagining that it might possess any other kind of value. The irony was almost too much to process. While the Hayes family had been subtly encouraging me to replace Elena's costume jewelry with something more appropriate, I had potentially been wearing something more valuable than anything in their carefully curated collection. But even as that thought crossed my mind, I realized that it didn't change how I felt about the ring. Whether it was worth $5 or $5,000, it was still the tangible connection I had to Elena's strength, her resilience, and her belief that true worth came from within. The difference was that now, maybe, I wouldn't have to choose between honoring her memory and fitting into Jonathan's world. Maybe, for the first time since joining the Hayes family, I could do both. Mr. Romano's preliminary tests took nearly an hour, during which I sat in the leather chair beside his workbench, watching him move between various instruments with the focused intensity of a surgeon. He had asked me to remain quiet during the process, explaining that he needed to concentrate fully on what he was discovering. The silence gave me time to think about how I had arrived at this moment, and more importantly, what it might mean for my relationship with Jonathan's family if their assumptions about Elena's ring proved to be as wrong as Mr. Romano's reactions suggested they might be. The Hayes family had a particular way of handling situations that didn't align with their expectations. When Jonathan had first brought me home to meet them, I had been acutely aware that I was being evaluated against some invisible standard that had been established long before my arrival. Margaret Hayes had the ability to make observations that sounded like compliments but felt like corrections. "How refreshing to meet someone so genuine," she had said after our first dinner together, and it had taken me months to realize that genuine was code for unsophisticated. "Jonathan has always been drawn to authenticity," Victoria had added, as if authenticity were a character flaw that Jonathan would eventually outgrow. Over the years, I had learned to decode their language. When Margaret described something as interesting, she meant unusual in a way that made her uncomfortable. When Victoria called something unique, she meant it didn't belong in their social circle. When Jonathan's father, William, declared something to have character, he was politely dismissing it as unsuitable for serious consideration. My grandmother's ring had been described as all three at various times, usually in the same conversation where someone would mention how wonderful it was that I chose to honor my heritage through my jewelry choices, as if wearing the ring were an act of stubborn nostalgia rather than a daily connection to the woman who had shaped my understanding of strength and perseverance. The irony of their attitude toward Elena had never been lost on me. The Hayes family prided themselves on their immigrant success story, though their version began with Jonathan's great-great-grandfather arriving from Ireland in the 1880s, with enough money to invest in Boston's growing textile industry. By the time the story reached Jonathan's generation, it had been refined into a narrative about vision, entrepreneurship, and the rewards of hard work. Elena's story was messier, more recent, and therefore somehow less dignified in their estimation. She had arrived as a refugee rather than an investor, had worked in factories rather than owning them, and had left behind a granddaughter who taught elementary school rather than a dynasty of business leaders and philanthropists. But watching Mr. Romano examine Elena's ring with such careful attention, I began to wonder if the Hayes family's assumptions about dignity and worth might be as flawed as their assumptions about jewelry. Elena had never spoken about her life in Europe before coming to America, but I had always sensed that her silence came from strength rather than shame. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with material possessions and everything to do with knowing she had survived circumstances that would have broken weaker people. The ring had been part of that confidence, worn not as decoration but as armor, a reminder of who she had been before circumstance forced her to become someone new. Mr. Romano finally set down his instruments and turned to face me, his expression more serious than when we had begun. "Mrs. Hayes, I need to explain what I've discovered, but I also need to recommend that we proceed very carefully with any further evaluation. What you're wearing is not costume jewelry, and it's not a simple vintage piece. The stone appears to be a natural diamond, and the setting shows craftsmanship consistent with European work from the early 20th century. However, the true significance of what you have here requires expertise beyond what I can provide in my shop." His words hit me with the force of physical impact. A natural diamond, European craftsmanship, early 20th century. None of these phrases aligned with the narrative I had constructed about Elena's ring, the story of a poor immigrant woman who had brought nothing of value from the old country, except her determination to build a better life for her children. But even as I struggled to process what Mr. Romano was telling me, another part of my mind was racing ahead to consider what this might mean for my place in the Hayes family hierarchy. "What kind of expertise are we talking about?" I asked, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. "Mr. Romano leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him in the gesture of someone about to deliver news that would change everything. "Mrs. Hayes, I believe you need to have this piece evaluated by a specialist in European estate jewelry, someone who can research its provenance and provide you with a formal appraisal. The stone alone, if it is what I think it might be, could be quite valuable. But more than that, the historical significance of the piece might be extraordinary. Historical significance. The phrase seemed to hang in the air between us, carrying implications I wasn't prepared to consider. Elena had been historical to me in the way that all grandmothers are historical to their grandchildren, a link to a past that seemed both distant and immediate. But the idea that she might have been historically significant in some larger sense, that the ring I wore every day might be connected to events or circumstances beyond our small family story, was overwhelming. I don't understand, I said finally. My grandmother was a factory worker. She lived in a small town in Ohio her entire adult life. She never spoke about having anything valuable, and she certainly never lived like someone who owned something worth a lot of money. How could her ring be historically significant? Mr. Romano's expression softened with understanding. Mrs. Hayes, history is full of ordinary people who carried extraordinary things. Wars, revolutions, economic upheavals. These events often separate people from their possessions in ways that make it impossible to maintain the lifestyle those possessions might otherwise support. A woman might flee her homeland with a valuable ring sewn into her coat, then spend the rest of her life working in a factory because selling the ring would mean losing the last connection to everything she had left behind. His words painted a picture of Elena that I had never considered. A version of my grandmother's story that included loss and sacrifice on a scale I was only beginning to comprehend. I had always known that she had left something behind when she came to America, but I had assumed that something was poverty and hardship. The possibility that she might have also left behind wealth, status, or position added layers of complexity to her decision to build a new life from nothing. But she never said anything, I protested. She never even hinted that the ring might be valuable. If she knew it was worth something significant, why wouldn't she have told someone? Why wouldn't she have used that knowledge to make life easier for herself and her children? Mr. Romano nodded as if he had heard this question many times before. There are many reasons why people choose not to reveal the value of pieces they own. Sometimes it's for safety, sometimes it's because they've lost the documentation needed to prove ownership or authenticity. Sometimes it's because the emotional value of keeping the piece intact outweighs any financial benefit that might come from selling it. And sometimes, Mrs. Hayes, it's because they want to leave the decision about what to do with that information to the next generation. The idea that Elena might have consciously chosen to leave me not just her ring, but the responsibility of deciding what to do with its potential significance, was both thrilling and terrifying. For 8 years, I had defended my choice to wear the ring based purely on sentimental grounds, never imagining that there might be objective reasons to value it. But now, faced with the possibility that Elena had entrusted me with something far more important than I had realized, I felt the weight of decisions I wasn't prepared to make. What happens next? I asked. Mr. Romano reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a business card. I'm going to refer you to Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. She specializes in European jewelry from the period when your ring was likely made, and she has access to databases and resources that can help trace its origins. But Mrs. Hayes, I need to warn you that once you begin this process, there's no going back to not knowing. If this ring is as significant as I suspect it might be, that knowledge will change how you think about it, how others think about it, and possibly how you think about your grandmother's story. The warning felt both ominous and liberating. For 8 years, I had lived with the Hayes family's certainty about Elena's ring, accepting their assessment of its worth because I had no information to contradict their assumptions. But knowledge, even knowledge that might complicate my understanding of Elena's choices, felt preferable to the constant doubt and defensiveness that had characterized my relationship with Jonathan's family. I want to know, I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. Whatever the truth is, I want to know it. Mr. Romano smiled for the first time since beginning his examination. I think your grandmother would be proud of that decision, Mrs. Hayes. She struck me as the kind of woman who valued truth over comfort. His words brought tears to my eyes, not because they were particularly profound, but because they were the first time in 8 years that anyone had spoken about Elena with the respect she deserved. The Hayes family had always treated her memory with polite tolerance, acknowledging her role in my life while making it clear that they considered her influence on me to be something I would eventually outgrow. But Mr. Romano spoke about her as if she had been a person worth knowing, someone whose choices deserved consideration rather than dismissal. As I left Romano's fine jewelry that afternoon, Elena's ring felt different on my finger. Not heavier, exactly, but more present, as if the possibility of its significance had awakened something that had been dormant for decades. I found myself looking at it with new eyes, noticing details I had overlooked for years. The way the stone caught light from certain angles, revealing depths and colors that weren't immediately apparent. The intricate metalwork around the setting, which I had always assumed was simply decorative but now recognized, might be indicative of a particular style or period. The overall proportions of the piece, which had always seemed modest to me but might actually reflect a different aesthetic tradition than the one I had learned to value through my association with the Hayes family. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with Elena's ring under a bright lamp, studying it with the kind of attention I usually reserved for my students' artwork or the lesson plans that required careful consideration. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine Elena not as the humble immigrant woman of family legend, but as someone who might have had secrets worth keeping. Someone who might have made sacrifices not just for survival, but for purposes I was only beginning to understand. Jonathan found me there when he came home from work, surrounded by the notes I had taken during my conversation with Mr. Romano and the research I had already begun about European jewelry from the early 20th century. He kissed the top of my head and settled into the chair beside me, reaching for my hand in the gesture that had always signaled his willingness to listen. "How did your appointment go?" he asked, and I could hear genuine curiosity in his voice, rather than the careful tolerance I had grown accustomed to when Elena's ring became the subject of conversation. I told him everything. About Mr. Romano's reaction, about the preliminary tests, about the possibility that Elena's ring might be far more significant than any of us had ever imagined. Jonathan listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as I explained what the next steps might involve. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, turning the information over in his mind with the same careful consideration he brought to complex legal problems. "Kathy," he said finally, "are you prepared for what this might mean? If the ring is as valuable as Mr. Romano suspects, it's going to change how people see you, how they see us, how they think about your family's story. My family is going to have to confront the fact that they've been wrong about something fundamental for 8 years. That's not going to be easy for them to accept." His concern was touching, but it also revealed how deeply the Hayes family's attitudes had influenced even his most private thoughts about my background. The idea that discovering the true value of Elena's ring might be difficult for his family to accept assumed that their comfort was more important than the truth about my grandmother's legacy. It assumed that I should be more concerned about their embarrassment than about finally understanding the full significance of what Elena had entrusted to me. "Jonathan," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I've spent 8 years worrying about how your family sees me, trying to fit into their expectations, accepting their assessment of my worth and my background. I think it's time I stopped worrying about their comfort and started focusing on understanding my own story." He squeezed my hand, and I could see in his eyes that he was beginning to understand the larger implications of what I was saying. This wasn't just about a ring anymore. It was about the way we had all accepted certain assumptions about value, worth, and respectability without questioning whether those assumptions were based on truth or simply on prejudice. It was about the way his family's certainty about their own superiority had prevented them from seeing Elena's story clearly, and by extension, from seeing me clearly. "What do you need from me?" he asked, and the question felt like the beginning of a conversation we should have had years earlier. "I need you to support my decision to find out the truth," I said. "Even if that truth makes your family uncomfortable. Even if it means admitting that they've been wrong about Elena, about her ring, and possibly about me. I need you to choose my side for once. Not because you have to as my husband, but because it's the right thing to do." Jonathan nodded slowly, and I could see him making the kind of internal calculation that had probably been necessary throughout our marriage, but had never been this explicit. Choosing between his family's expectations and his wife's needs. Choosing between the comfortable assumptions that had shaped his understanding of our relationship and the more complex truths that were beginning to emerge. "I'm with you," he said finally. "Whatever we find out, however this changes things, I'm with you." His words felt like a gift, not because they were particularly eloquent, but because they represented a shift in the fundamental dynamics that had governed our marriage since the beginning. For the first time, Jonathan was choosing to prioritize my story over his family's comfort, my needs over their expectations. It felt like the beginning of a marriage that might actually be built on equality rather than accommodation. That night, as I prepared for bed, I held Elena's ring up to the light one more time, trying to see it the way Mr. Romano had seen it, the way Dr. Hartwell might see it when I brought it to the museum for evaluation. But more than that, I tried to see it the way Elena had seen it every day for the 43 years she had worn it in America. Not as a symbol of what she had lost, but as a reminder of who she had always been underneath the circumstances that had shaped the visible contours of her life. For 8 years, I had defended Elena's ring based on love and loyalty, never imagining that those might not be the only reasons it deserved respect. Now, with the possibility that Elena had left me something far more significant than I had ever understood, I felt the weight of responsibility settling around me like a cloak. Whatever the truth about the ring turned out to be, I owed it to Elena's memory to face that truth with the same courage she had shown when she decided to build a new life in a country that would never fully understand the story she carried with her. The woman who had taught me to make pierogi and told me fractured stories about snow that fell differently in the old country had also apparently taught me to carry secrets worth keeping. Now it was time to discover what those secrets might reveal about the legacy she had truly left behind. The appointment with Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts was scheduled for the following Thursday, giving me nearly a week to exist in the strange liminal space between not knowing and potentially knowing everything. During that week, I found myself observing my daily interactions with Jonathan's family through a completely different lens, suddenly aware of how their assumptions about Elena and her legacy had shaped not just their treatment of my ring, but their entire understanding of who I was and where I belonged in their carefully ordered world. The shift in my perspective became most apparent during our regular Wednesday dinner at Margaret and William's Beacon Hill townhouse. These weekly gatherings had been a Hayes family tradition long before Jonathan and I married, an opportunity for the family to maintain their connections and coordinate their various social and charitable obligations. I had initially been intimidated by these dinners, overwhelmed by conversations that referenced people and events I had never heard of, struggling to contribute meaningfully to discussions about museum board politics or the social dynamics of organizations I had never been invited to join. Over the years, I had found my place in these gatherings by becoming an appreciative audience, asking thoughtful questions about Victoria's latest philanthropic project, or Margaret's insights into Boston society dynamics. I had learned to dress appropriately, to bring suitable hostess gifts, and to navigate the unspoken rules that governed everything from seating arrangements to the timing of various conversational topics. But I had never felt like a full participant in these evenings, always aware that my contributions were welcomed more for their politeness than for any particular insight or expertise I might offer. This particular Wednesday, however, I found myself listening to the familiar conversations with new ears. When Victoria launched into her usual commentary about the declining standards of a certain charity auction, criticizing the organizers for accepting donations that didn't meet her definition of appropriate quality, I couldn't help but think about her years of dismissive comments about Elena's ring. When Margaret shared her concerns about a family friend who had recently married someone from what she delicately described as a different background, I wondered what she had really thought during those early months of my marriage to Jonathan, when she was still forming her opinions about whether I would be a suitable addition to the Hayes family legacy. Most significantly, when William began telling a story about a recent discovery at his law firm involving a client who had unknowingly inherited a valuable painting, I felt the weight of Elena's ring on my finger in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. The painting in William's story had been hanging in the client's modest apartment for decades, dismissed by family members as a sentimental piece with no real value, until an art expert had recognized it as the work of a significant but undervalued artist. The client, William explained with the kind of pleased satisfaction he reserved for stories with satisfying endings, was now able to retire comfortably on the proceeds from the painting's sale. It just goes to show, William concluded, raising his wine glass in a gesture that encompassed the entire table, that you never know what treasures might be hiding in plain sight. Though I suppose it helps to have the right kind of expert take a look at these things before you make assumptions about their worth. The irony of his words was so sharp it was almost painful. Here was a man who had spent 8 years making assumptions about the worth of Elena's ring, dismissing it as the kind of sentimental trinket that immigrants often mistook for valuable jewelry, now holding forth about the importance of expert evaluation and the dangers of premature judgment. I caught Jonathan's eye across the table and saw that he was thinking the same thing, his expression carefully neutral, but his awareness of our shared secret evident in the slight tension around his eyes. "That's fascinating, Dad," Jonathan said, his voice carrying just enough emphasis to let me know he was thinking about our situation. "It makes you wonder how often people dismiss things without really understanding what they're looking at." Margaret nodded approvingly at her son's observation. "Exactly. It's why breeding and education matter so much. People from certain backgrounds develop an eye for quality, an instinct for recognizing value even when it's not immediately obvious. It's not something you can learn from books." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt something shift inside me that I had never experienced during these family dinners before. Instead of the usual combination of inadequacy and determination to prove myself worthy of their acceptance, I felt a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with their approval. Whether Elena's ring proved to be valuable or not, Margaret's certainty about her own superior judgment was about to be tested in ways she couldn't possibly anticipate. "I think you might be surprised," I said quietly, "by how much people from all kinds of backgrounds can recognize about quality and value, especially when it comes to things that have been important to their families." Victoria looked up from her phone, where she had been scrolling through what appeared to be photos from a recent social event. "Oh, absolutely, Kathy. Family pieces always have such wonderful sentimental value. It's lovely that you've held onto your grandmother's things." The condescension in her tone was so familiar that I might not have noticed it a week earlier, but now it struck me as both offensive and potentially humorous. Victoria's certainty about the relative value of sentimental versus actual worth was about to collide with a reality she had never considered possible. The woman she had spent years treating as charmingly naive about jewelry and social status might be wearing something more significant than anything in Victoria's carefully curated collection. "Yes," I agreed, my voice steady and pleasant. "Family pieces can be full of surprises." The conversation moved on to other topics, but I spent the rest of the evening observing the Hayes family dynamics with the detached fascination of an anthropologist studying a culture she was no longer trying to join. Their confidence in their own judgment, their casual dismissal of perspectives that didn't align with their established worldview, their assumption that breeding and education were the only reliable indicators of worth or sophistication, all of these attitudes suddenly seemed far more fragile than they had appeared when I was desperately seeking their approval. After dinner, as Jonathan and I drove home through the narrow streets of Beacon Hill, he reached over and took my hand, his thumb stroking across Elena's ring in a gesture that had become automatic over the years of our marriage. "You were different tonight," he said, and I could hear both curiosity and admiration in his voice. "More? I don't know how to describe it. More yourself, maybe?" I considered his observation as we waited at a red light, watching well-dressed couples emerge from expensive restaurants and disappear into the warmth of their perfectly appointed homes. "I think I'm finally starting to understand the difference between being polite and being myself," I said. "For 8 years, I've been so focused on fitting in with your family that I lost track of who I was before I met you. But Elena's ring, whatever it turns out to be, it's reminding me that I come from people who had their own kind of strength and dignity." Jonathan was quiet for a moment, processing what I had said. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I'm sorry that it took this long for me to see how much of yourself you were giving up to make my family comfortable. I'm sorry that I didn't defend you better, or question their assumptions more directly." His apology felt genuine, but it also revealed how much work we still had to do in rebuilding our marriage on more equal terms. The damage hadn't been intentional, but it had been real, and it would take time to undo the patterns of accommodation and diminishment that had characterized our relationship from the beginning. We both made choices, I said. I chose to make myself smaller rather than risk conflict. You chose to avoid difficult conversations rather than challenge your family's attitudes. But we can make different choices now. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of anticipation that I hadn't experienced since the early days of my teaching career, when every day brought new challenges and discoveries. I had always loved the moment when a struggling student suddenly grasped a concept they had been wrestling with. The way their face would light up, with the recognition that they were capable of understanding more than they had believed possible. Now I was about to experience that same moment of revelation, but about my own family's story rather than about academic material. I arrived at the Museum of Fine Arts 30 minutes early, partly because I had underestimated Boston traffic, and partly because I was too nervous to sit at home any longer. The museum's European Decorative Arts wing was quieter than the main galleries, filled with the kind of serious visitors who came to study rather than simply to see. I found myself drawn to the jewelry displays, looking at pieces from the same historical period when Elena's ring had likely been made, trying to understand the context that might explain its origins. The jewelry in the museum cases was undeniably beautiful, but it was also undeniably connected to wealth and privilege, in ways that didn't align with my understanding of Elena's circumstances. These were pieces commissioned by aristocrats and wealthy merchants, created by master craftsmen for people who had the resources to commission custom work, and the social position to wear it publicly. Elena had been a refugee, a factory worker, a single mother struggling to provide for 5 children. How could she have possessed something that belonged in the same category as the treasures displayed behind the museum's climate-controlled glass? Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell appeared at my side while I was studying a particularly ornate necklace from 1920s Vienna, her approach so quiet that I didn't notice her until she spoke. "Mrs. Hayes? I'm Elizabeth Hartwell. I hope you haven't been waiting long." Dr. Hartwell was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of understated elegance that spoke of genuine expertise rather than social pretension. She wore a simple gray dress and minimal jewelry, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew her field intimately and didn't need external validation of her knowledge. "Not at all," I replied, suddenly feeling foolish for arriving so early. I was just looking at these pieces and wondering how my grandmother's ring could possibly be connected to this kind of craftsmanship. Dr. Hartwell smiled with the warmth of someone who had heard similar expressions of doubt many times before. "You'd be surprised how often family pieces turn out to have much more interesting histories than their current owners realize. Shall we go to my office where we can examine your ring properly?" Her office was a combination of scholarly workspace and miniature museum, with reference books lining every available wall space and carefully organized display cases containing examples of jewelry from various historical periods. Dr. Hartwell gestured for me to sit at a small table that had been equipped with the same kind of high-powered lighting and magnification equipment I had seen at Romano's fine jewelry, but with additional tools that looked more sophisticated than anything Mr. Romano had used. "Before we begin," Dr. Hartwell said, settling into the chair across from me, "I want to explain my process and make sure you understand what we're trying to accomplish today. Mr. Romano's preliminary assessment suggests that your ring may be significant, but museum quality evaluation requires much more detailed analysis. I'll be looking at the stone, the setting, the construction techniques, and any marks or signatures that might help us identify when and where the piece was made. I'll also be taking detailed photographs and measurements that can be compared to our databases of known pieces." She paused, studying my face with the kind of attention that suggested she was evaluating my readiness for whatever she might discover. "Mrs. Hayes, I need to ask you directly, are you prepared for the possibility that this evaluation might reveal information about your grandmother's background that doesn't align with the story you've been told about her life?" The question caught me off guard, not because I hadn't considered the possibility, but because hearing it stated so directly forced me to confront how much my identity was tied to my understanding of Elena's story. "What kind of information?" I asked. "Family jewelry often carries information about social class, geographic origins, and historical circumstances that may have been deliberately obscured or forgotten over time," Dr. Hartwell explained. "If your grandmother fled Europe under difficult circumstances, she may have had reasons for not sharing details about her previous life. Learning those details now might change how you understand her choices and her legacy." I thought about Elena's silence regarding her life before America, her reluctance to discuss the circumstances that had brought her to Ohio, her consistent focus on the future rather than the past. I had always attributed her reticence to the natural immigrant desire to assimilate, to leave old world troubles behind in favor of new world opportunities. But Dr. Hartwell's question suggested that Elena's silence might have been protecting secrets, rather than simply reflecting a preference for looking forward rather than backward. I want to know, I said, echoing the words I had spoken to Mr. Romano. Whatever the truth is, I think Elena would want me to know it. Dr. Hartwell nodded approvingly and extended her hand. In that case, may I see the ring? I slipped Elena's ring off my finger for the first time in 8 years, feeling strangely naked without its familiar weight. Dr. Hartwell accepted it with the kind of careful reverence that museum curators reserve for potentially significant pieces, immediately placing it under her most powerful magnification equipment. What followed was the most thorough examination any object in my possession had ever received. Dr. Hartwell studied every aspect of the ring with painstaking attention, making notes in a leather-bound journal, and occasionally taking photographs with a specialized camera that could capture details invisible to the naked eye. She measured the stone from multiple angles, tested the metal composition of the setting, and examined what appeared to be tiny marks on the interior of the band, with the focused intensity of a detective studying crucial evidence. After nearly 2 hours, she finally looked up from her equipment, her expression serious but not unpleasant. Mrs. Hayes, I need to make some calls and do some additional research before I can give you a complete assessment, but I can tell you with certainty that what you have here is extraordinary. The stone is a natural fancy yellow diamond, approximately 3.2 carats, with characteristics that suggest it originated in one of the South African mines that were active in the early 1900s. The setting is platinum, and the craftsmanship indicates European origin, most likely German or Austrian work from between 1910 and 1920. Her words washed over me like cold water, each technical detail adding weight to a conclusion I was still struggling to process. Natural fancy yellow diamond. 3.2 carats. European craftsmanship. Early 20th century. These were not terms that belonged in the same sentence as Elena Kowalski, factory worker from Millbrook, Ohio. What does that mean in terms of value? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Doctor. Hartwell leaned back in her chair, choosing her words carefully. Mrs. Hayes, without a complete provenance research and formal appraisal, I can't give you an exact figure. But based on the stone quality, the historical period, and the craftsmanship, you're looking at a piece that could easily be worth several $100,000, possibly much more. The room seemed to tilt around me as the implications of her words sank in. Several $100,000, possibly much more. Elena had worn a piece worth more money than I would earn in several years of teaching, had scrubbed floors and worked double shifts while carrying a fortune on her finger, had raised 5 children in poverty while possessing something that could have changed all of their lives. But that's not the most significant aspect of what you've brought me, Dr. Hartwell continued, her voice gentle but insistent. Mrs. Hayes, the markings on the interior of the band, combined with the stone characteristics and the setting style, suggest that this ring may have a documented history. If I'm correct about what I think I'm seeing, this piece may be connected to a specific family or estate whose jewelry was dispersed during the political upheavals of the early 20th century. Political upheavals, dispersed jewelry, documented history. The academic language couldn't disguise the human drama that Dr. Hartwell was describing. The reality that Elena's ring might be connected to someone else's tragedy, someone else's loss, someone else's story of displacement and survival. What kind of family, I asked, though I was no longer certain I wanted to hear the answer. That's what I need to research, Dr. Hartwell replied. But Mrs. Hayes, if this ring has the provenance I suspect it might have, you're not just the owner of a valuable piece of jewelry. You may be the guardian of an important piece of history. 3 weeks later, Dr. Hartwell called me with information that would reshape everything I thought I knew about Elena's life before America. Her research had led her through archives in Vienna, Berlin, and Prague, connecting Elena's ring to the estate of the Rothenberg family. prominent Jewish intellectuals and art collectors who had fled Austria in 1938, as the Nazi regime tightened its grip on Jewish assets and lives. The ring, according to Documentation Drive, Hartwell had uncovered, had belonged to Clara Rothenberg, a young woman who had disappeared during the chaos of the early war years and was presumed to have died in one of the concentration camps. But Elena Kowalski wasn't Clara Rothenberg. Dr. Hartwell's research had revealed a more complex truth that took several conversations for me to fully understand. Elena had worked as a household servant for the Rothenberg family in Vienna, where she had formed a close friendship with Clara, who was only 3 years older than Elena herself. When the family realized they needed to flee Austria, Clara had given Elena several pieces of jewelry, including the ring, with instructions to either return them after the war if Clara survived, or to keep them if she did not. Elena had escaped Vienna with false papers, identifying her as a Polish refugee rather than an Austrian household servant, and had spent 4 years in displaced persons camps before finally securing passage to America in 1952. The revelation that Elena had been protecting not just her own secrets but also honoring the memory of a young woman who had entrusted her with precious family heirlooms added layers of complexity to my understanding of the grandmother who had shaped so much of my moral development. Elena hadn't simply been a poor immigrant who happened to possess something valuable. She had been the keeper of someone else's legacy, carrying the weight of promises made to a friend who had not survived to reclaim her family's treasures. Dr. Hartwell's research had also uncovered letters that Clara Rothenberg had written to Elena during the early months of the war, before communication became impossible. These letters, preserved in archives that documented the correspondence of Holocaust victims, revealed a friendship that had transcended the class differences between employer and servant. Clara had written about her fears for her family's safety, her hope that they would all be reunited after the war, and her gratitude that Elena had agreed to safeguard items that represented not just financial value but generations of family history. Reading these letters, I began to understand why Elena had never spoken about the ring's origins or value. She hadn't been hiding her own secret wealth. She had been honoring a promise to a friend who had died, trusting her to make the right decisions about preserving the Rothenberg family legacy. For 43 years, Elena had worn Clara's ring while working in an Ohio textile factory, keeping alive the memory of a young woman whose own life had been cut short by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The emotional weight of this discovery was overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to the practical implications of what Dr. Hartwell had uncovered. The Rothenberg family had other surviving members, cousins and distant relatives, who had escaped Europe and built new lives in places like New York, London, and Tel Aviv. Some of these relatives had been searching for decades for any trace of family artifacts that had been lost during the war, hoping to recover pieces that might help them maintain connections to ancestors whose graves they would never be able to visit. Dr. Hartwell had already made contact with the Rothenberg Family Foundation, an organization established by surviving family members to document and, when possible, recover artifacts that had belonged to family members who had perished in the Holocaust. The foundation's director, a woman named Rachel Rothenberg Cohen, who was Clara's cousin's granddaughter, had expressed immediate interest in learning more about Elena's ring and the circumstances under which it had been preserved. The possibility of returning the ring to Clara's surviving family members forced me to confront questions I had never imagined having to consider. Was I morally obligated to give up Elena's ring if it rightfully belonged to someone else? Did Elena's decades of faithful guardianship give me any claim to keep the ring, or had she simply been holding it in trust until it could be returned to its proper owners? What would Elena herself have wanted me to do if she had lived long enough to learn that Clara's family had survivors who were actively searching for remnants of their lost heritage? These questions became even more complicated when Dr. Hartwell explained the financial implications of what we had discovered. The ring's connection to the Rothenberg family had been verified through multiple sources, including insurance records and estate documentation that had survived the war. But more significantly, the ring was part of a larger collection of Rothenberg family jewelry that had been insured for astronomical amounts in the 1930s. When adjusted for current market values and the increased rarity of pieces that had survived the war, Elena's ring was now estimated to be worth not several $100,000, but approximately $2.1 million. $2.1 million. The number was so large that it seemed abstract, disconnected from the reality of the simple band I had worn to work every day for 8 years. But the implications were concrete enough. This was more money than Jonathan and I would earn in our combined lifetimes. It was enough to pay off our mortgage, fund graduate school if I decided to pursue administration, ensure that we could provide for children if we decided to start a family, and still leave us with resources we had never dreamed of possessing. But it was also money that might rightfully belong to people who had lost everything else that connected them to family members murdered during one of history's darkest periods. The moral weight of keeping something that might provide comfort and connection to Holocaust survivors was enormous, regardless of Elena's role in preserving it, or my own emotional attachment to the ring as a symbol of my grandmother's strength and love. I spent sleepless nights wrestling with these questions, trying to imagine what Elena would have advised if she had been able to foresee this moment. Had she intended for me to eventually return the ring to the Rothenberg family, or had Clara's gift been meant to become part of Elena's family legacy? Had Elena told me stories about the importance of keeping promises and honoring commitments precisely because she knew that someday I would face decisions about how to handle the trust she had accepted from Clara Rothenberg? The answer came to me during one of those sleepless nights, as I sat in my kitchen holding the ring under the same bright lamp where I had first studied it after Mr. Romano's evaluation. Elena had spent 43 years living with the knowledge that she possessed something valuable that didn't belong to her, but she had never attempted to sell it or use it to improve her own circumstances. She had worked double shifts and raised 5 children in poverty while wearing a fortune on her finger, because she understood that some things were more important than personal comfort or financial security. Elena's example showed me that the right choice wasn't necessarily the easy choice, or even the choice that would benefit me most directly. The right choice was the choice that honored the trust Clara Rothenberg had placed in a young household servant who had promised to protect her family's legacy until it could be properly restored. The next morning, I called Dr. Hartwell and asked her to arrange a meeting with Rachel Rothenberg Cohen. I wanted to learn more about Clara's family, to understand what the ring meant to the people who had spent decades searching for traces of their lost relatives, and to explore whether there might be a way to honor both Elena's guardianship and Clara's family's rightful claim to their heritage. The meeting took place at the museum, in the same office where Dr. Hartwell had first revealed the ring's true significance. Rachel Rothenberg Cohen was a woman in her 60s, with gray hair and intelligent eyes that reminded me immediately of the photographs Dr. Hartwell had shown me of Clara Rothenberg. She brought with her a leather portfolio containing documents, photographs, and letters that told the story of the Rothenberg family's destruction and the surviving members' decades-long effort to piece together what had been lost. "Mrs. Hayes," Rachel said, accepting the offer of coffee that Dr. Hartwell had prepared for our meeting, "I want you to understand that what your grandmother did, preserving Clara's ring for all these years, was an act of extraordinary courage and faithfulness. During the war, many people who were entrusted with Jewish property chose to keep it for themselves or to sell it for their own benefit. Your grandmother chose to honor a promise even when doing so provided her with no advantage and potentially put her at risk." Her words brought tears to my eyes, not just because they validated Elena's choices, but because they helped me understand the moral complexity of the situation Elena had navigated for more than 4 decades. Elena had known the ring's value, had understood that it belonged to someone else, and had still chosen to preserve it rather than use it to ease her own struggles, or provide opportunities for her children that would otherwise have been impossible. "What I don't understand," I said, "is why Elena never tried to contact Clara's family after the war. If she was protecting the ring for Clara, why didn't she attempt to return it when it became clear that Clara wasn't going to survive?" Rachel's expression grew sad but understanding. "Mrs. Hayes, you have to remember what communication was like in the 1950s and 1960s, especially for someone in your grandmother's position. There was no internet, no easy way to search for surviving family members who had scattered across multiple continents. Many Holocaust survivors changed their names when they immigrated to new countries, making it almost impossible to trace family connections. And frankly, many people who had survived the war didn't want to be found. The trauma was too great, the desire to start completely new lives too strong. She opened her portfolio and withdrew a photograph of Clara Rothenberg, a young woman with dark hair and a serious expression, wearing the very ring that now sat on Dr. Hartwell's examination table. Clara was 22 years old when she gave your grandmother this ring. She was engaged to be married to a young man who was also killed during the war. This ring was her engagement ring, given to her by a man she loved and lost before they could build a life together. The weight of what Rachel was telling me settled over the room like a heavy blanket. The ring that I had worn as a symbol of Elena's love and strength was also a symbol of Clara's lost love, her interrupted dreams, her family's destroyed legacy. It carried the hopes and promises of people who had been murdered simply for being who they were, and it had been preserved by a woman who had understood the sacred responsibility of keeping other people's dreams alive. "I want to return it to your family," I said, the words coming out more easily than I had expected. Elena was keeping it safe until it could come home. "I think it's time." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head gently. "Mrs. Hayes, that's incredibly generous, but I don't think it's what Clara would have wanted, and I don't think it's what your grandmother would have wanted either. Clara gave your grandmother that ring because she trusted her to make good decisions about its future. Your grandmother kept it safe for 43 years and then passed it to someone she trusted to continue making good decisions. I think the decision about what to do with the ring should be yours to make." The conversation that followed lasted for hours, as Rachel shared stories about Clara's personality, her relationship with Elena, and her family's values and priorities. What emerged was a picture of a young woman who would have been far more concerned with ensuring that the ring continued to provide meaning and connection for the people who possessed it than with recovering a family heirloom that could never truly replace what had been lost. By the end of our meeting, Rachel and I had worked out an arrangement that felt right for everyone involved. I would keep Elena's ring, continuing to wear it as a symbol of the friendship between Elena and Clara and the responsibility that connected their stories. But I would also establish a foundation in Elena's and Clara's names, using a portion of the ring's appraised value to support educational programs about Holocaust history and refugee experiences. The foundation would ensure that their story continued to teach and inspire long after the people who had known them personally were gone. The Hayes family's reaction to the news about Elena's ring was everything I had expected and more satisfying than I had dared to hope. When Jonathan and I gathered them together to share what we had discovered, the look of shock on Margaret's face when Dr. Hartwell explained the ring's value and historical significance was worth 8 years of subtle condescension and gentle corrections about my family's background and social status. Victoria's attempt to maintain her composure while processing the fact that the, quote, garage sale jewelry she had mocked for years was worth more than her entire collection was particularly amusing. She kept asking for clarification about the appraisal, as if Dr. Hartwell might have made an error that would restore the natural order of things and confirm Victoria's superior judgment about quality and value. But the most significant reaction came from Margaret, who had spent 8 years treating Elena's memory with polite tolerance, while making it clear that she considered Elena's influence on me to be something I would eventually outgrow with proper guidance and education. Margaret's discovery that Elena had been entrusted with preserving the legacy of a family whose sophistication and wealth exceeded anything the Hayes family had ever achieved forced her to confront the limitations of her own assumptions about breeding, background, and the reliable indicators of worth. "I don't understand," Margaret said finally, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "If your grandmother knew the ring was valuable, why did she continue working in that factory? Why didn't she use it to improve her circumstances?" The question revealed how completely Margaret had missed the point of everything we had just explained. Elena's choice to preserve Clara's ring while living in poverty hadn't been the result of ignorance or misplaced sentiment. It had been the result of understanding that some responsibilities are more important than personal comfort, that some promises matter more than financial advantage, that some kinds of wealth have nothing to do with money. "Because she understood something about honor that can't be taught in finishing school," I replied, meeting Margaret's eyes directly for the first time in 8 years without feeling the need to apologize for my directness. "She understood that being trusted with something precious means protecting it, even when doing so requires sacrifice." The silence that followed my words stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. but I didn't try to fill it with softer language or diplomatic explanations. The Hayes family needed to sit with the reality that their assumptions about Elena, about me, and about the reliable indicators of character and worth had been fundamentally wrong. They needed to understand that the woman they had dismissed as a simple immigrant factory worker had actually been the guardian of a legacy more significant than anything in their own family history. Jonathan reached for my hand across the table, his fingers finding Elena's ring and holding it gently. I think what Kathy is saying is that her grandmother's real gift wasn't the ring itself, but the example she set about what it means to be trustworthy, to keep promises even when they're difficult to keep, and to value character over comfort. His words felt like a public declaration of the shift that had been occurring in our marriage since the ring's true significance had been revealed. For the first time since we had begun dating, Jonathan was choosing to prioritize my perspective over his family's comfort, defending my family's values rather than apologizing for the ways they didn't align with Hayes' family expectations. Later that evening, as we drove home from what would be our last weekly dinner at Margaret and William's house for quite some time, Jonathan and I talked about the changes that the ring's revelation had brought to our relationship and our understanding of ourselves. The knowledge that Elena had entrusted me with something far more significant than either of us had realized had given me permission to trust my own judgment about what mattered and what didn't, about which relationships deserved my energy and which expectations deserved my accommodation. I keep thinking about how different these 8 years might have been if we had known the truth about the ring from the beginning, Jonathan said, as we stopped at a red light near our apartment. Would it have been different? I asked. Would your family have treated me differently if they had known Elena was protecting something valuable? Or would they have just found different reasons to question whether I belonged in their world? Jonathan considered my question seriously, and I could see him wrestling with the uncomfortable possibility that his family's treatment of me had been based on prejudices that no amount of external validation could have overcome. I think you're right, he said finally. I think they would have found other ways to make you feel like you didn't quite measure up. The ring was just a convenient symbol for attitudes that went much deeper. His honesty was painful but necessary, and it opened space for the kinds of conversations we had been avoiding throughout our marriage. We talked about the ways his family's expectations had shaped his own behavior, about the pressure I had felt to prove myself worthy of their acceptance, and about the different future we might build together, now that we both understood how much energy we had been wasting on trying to satisfy people who were never going to see us clearly. 6 months later, Elena and Clara's foundation held its first educational event, a symposium on immigrant experiences and Holocaust remembrance that brought together historians, survivors, and community members to share stories about preservation, loss, and the ways that individual choices can honor collective memory. Rachel Rothenberg-Cohen served as the keynote speaker, sharing Clara's story and Elena's decision to preserve her friend's legacy, even when doing so required personal sacrifice. I wore Elena's ring to the symposium, as I had worn it every day since learning its true significance. But now when people noticed it, when they asked about its history, or complimented its unique beauty, I had a story to tell that was about more than just my grandmother's love. I could share the story of 2 young women whose friendship had transcended class differences and national boundaries, whose trust and faithfulness had preserved something precious through one of history's darkest periods. The Hayes family attended the symposium, sitting in the back row and listening as speaker after speaker described the courage required to protect other people's dreams and the responsibility that comes with being entrusted with preserving important stories. I could see Margaret and Victoria struggling to reconcile their previous dismissal of Elena's ring with the reverence that educated, sophisticated people were now showing for the legacy Elena had protected. But more importantly, I could see Jonathan beginning to understand the difference between the kind of respect that comes from social position and the kind that comes from moral courage. The ring had revealed more than Elena's secret. It had revealed the limitations of his family's values and the strength of the principles I had inherited from a woman who had understood that true worth has nothing to do with other people's opinions. As the symposium concluded and people began to leave, Rachel approached me with a small wrapped package. "This belonged to Clara too," she said, pressing the package into my hands. "Her family would like you to have it, as a thank you for everything Elena did and everything you're continuing to do to honor their memory. Inside the package was a small silver locket containing a photograph of Clara and Elena together, taken in Vienna before the war changed everything. They were young women laughing at something outside the frame, their arms linked in the universal gesture of friendship, Clara's engagement ring clearly visible on her left hand. Looking at the photograph, I could see the beginning of the promise that Elena had kept for more than 40 years, the moment when two young women had decided to trust each other with the things that mattered most. Elena had honored that trust by preserving Clara's ring and passing it to someone who would continue the story with the same faithfulness Clara had originally placed in a household servant, who became the guardian of her family's legacy. That night, as I prepared for bed, I held Elena's ring up to the light one final time, seeing it now not as a symbol of the grandmother who had raised me, but as a symbol of the responsibility that connects all of us to protect the things that matter for the people who will come after us. Elena had understood that being entrusted with something precious means protecting it, even when no one is watching, even when the sacrifice is significant, even when the people who benefit will never know your name. The Hayes family had spent 8 years trying to teach me about quality, breeding, and the reliable indicators of worth. But Elena had already taught me everything I needed to know about those things. She had shown me that true quality lies in keeping your promises, that real breeding means raising children who understand the difference between having things and deserving them, and that the most reliable indicator of worth is how you treat the responsibilities that no one else knows you carry. I slipped the ring back onto my finger, where it belonged, where it had always belonged, and where it would stay as long as I was worthy of the trust that Elena and Clara had placed in the future. Tomorrow there would be foundation work to do, stories to preserve, and legacies to honor. But tonight, there was just the quiet satisfaction of understanding that the woman who had taught me to make pierogi and told me stories about snow had also taught me everything I needed to know about courage, faithfulness, and the kind of wealth that increases when you give it away. 2 years after the symposium, I found myself standing in the same museum office where Dr. Hartwell had first revealed Elena's ring's true significance. But this time, I wasn't alone. Beside me stood my daughter, Emma Rose Hayes, 18 months old, and fascinated by the way the light from Dr. Hartwell's examination equipment made rainbow patterns on the ceiling. Emma had been born exactly 1 year after the Foundation's first event, and she wore a tiny replica of Elena's ring on a chain around her neck, a gift from Rachel Rothenberg-Cohen, who had become not just a colleague in our Foundation work, but a dear friend whose wisdom about preserving family legacies had shaped how Jonathan and I approached building our own. Dr. Hartwell was examining a new piece that had been brought to our attention through the Foundation's work, a silver bracelet that another family had discovered among their grandmother's possessions after her death. The grandmother, like Elena, had been a refugee from Eastern Europe, who had spent decades in America without speaking about her life before immigration. The bracelet, like Elena's ring, had been dismissed by younger family members as costume jewelry until our Foundation's educational work had encouraged them to seek professional evaluation. "It's remarkable how often this happens," Dr. Hartwell said, looking up from her magnifying equipment with the same expression of wonder I remembered from our first meeting. "Your Foundation's work is uncovering stories that might have remained hidden forever." This bracelet appears to be from the same historical period as Elena's ring, possibly from the same region, and it's clearly been preserved with the same kind of careful attention. The discovery of similar pieces through our Foundation's work had revealed that Elena and Clara's story was not unique. Across the country, families were discovering that their immigrant grandmothers had carried precious objects through circumstances that had required them to hide rather than display their value. Some of these objects were financially valuable. Others were significant primarily for their historical importance. But all of them carried stories about survival, sacrifice, and the complex decisions that refugees had been forced to make about what to preserve and what to leave behind. Emma gurgled contentedly in my arms, reaching for the sparkling equipment with the fearless curiosity that characterized her approach to everything in her small world. She had no understanding yet of the significance of the work being done around her, but she was growing up in an environment where family stories were treasured rather than dismissed, where immigrant experiences were honored rather than minimized, and where the complex moral decisions that previous generations had faced were discussed openly rather than buried in silence. Jonathan had taken a leave of absence from his law firm to help manage the foundation's growing work, a decision that had surprised everyone, including himself. The man who had once been reluctant to challenge his family's assumptions about social status and appropriate behavior had become passionate about documenting and preserving the stories of people whose experiences had been overlooked or undervalued by traditional historical narratives. His legal background had proven invaluable in helping families navigate the complex ethical and practical questions that arose when valuable objects surfaced after decades of being hidden in plain sight. The Kowalski-Rothenberg Foundation has received 3 more inquiries this week, Jonathan said, joining us in Dr. Hartwell's office after finishing a phone consultation with a family in Michigan whose recently deceased father had left behind what appeared to be valuable artwork that no one had known he possessed. A pottery collection in Seattle, some jewelry in Baltimore, and a family in Phoenix who found old documents that suggest their grandfather might have been connected to some kind of art dealing before the war. Each new inquiry represented not just potential historical discoveries, but also families grappling with questions similar to those Jonathan and I had faced when we learned about Elena's ring. What obligations did they have to research the origins of objects they had inherited? How should they balance their emotional attachment to family heirlooms with the possibility that those items might rightfully belong to someone else? What was the difference between honoring their ancestors' choices and correcting historical injustices that their ancestors might not have had the resources to address? These questions had become central to my own understanding of what Elena had really left me. The ring itself was important, but the moral framework for thinking about responsibility, trust, and the preservation of other people's legacies was the real inheritance. Elena had spent 43 years modeling how to carry other people's stories with dignity and care, how to make decisions based on principles rather than convenience, and how to honor commitments even when no one else knew those commitments existed. The Foundation's work had also revealed how many assumptions I had made about Elena's silence regarding her past. I had always attributed her reluctance to discuss her life before America to the natural immigrant desire to focus on the future, rather than dwelling on old-world troubles. But our research into the experiences of other refugees from Elena's generation had shown that silence was often a survival strategy, a way of protecting not just personal secrets, but also the secrets of people who had entrusted them with information or objects that could be dangerous if discovered by the wrong people. Elena's decision to present herself in Millbrook, Ohio as a simple Polish refugee rather than as someone who had worked for a wealthy Jewish family in Vienna had probably been motivated by the practical recognition that anti-Semitism and suspicion of people with complex wartime experiences could make integration into American society more difficult. By keeping Clara's story private, Elena had been protecting not just Clara's memory, but also her own family's chances of building stable, successful lives in their new country. Understanding this context had helped me appreciate the courage required for Elena to preserve Clara's ring, while maintaining the fiction that it was simply a piece of costume jewelry she had brought from the old country. For 43 years, she had worn a fortune on her finger while living in poverty, not because she didn't understand its value, but because she understood that its value was more complex than its monetary worth. The ring represented a promise made to a friend who had died, trusting Elena to make good decisions about preserving her family's legacy, and Elena had honored that promise even when doing so required personal sacrifice. The Foundation's educational work had also helped me understand how the Hayes family's attitudes toward Elena and her ring reflected broader cultural patterns about whose stories are considered worthy of preservation and whose experiences are treated as historically significant. The same social dynamics that had led Margaret and Victoria to dismiss Elena's ring as unsuitable for serious consideration had prevented countless other families from recognizing the historical importance of objects and stories that didn't align with conventional narratives about American success and social mobility. Margaret's relationship with Emma provided a particularly clear example of how the revelation about Elena's ring had forced the Hayes family to confront their own prejudices and assumptions. Margaret, who had spent 8 years treating Elena's influence on me as something I would eventually outgrow with proper guidance, now found herself desperate to establish a meaningful connection with a granddaughter who carried both Elena's ring on a chain around her neck and Elena's name as her middle name. Margaret's attempts to bond with Emma often involved elaborate gifts and carefully planned educational activities that reflected her belief that the right kind of exposure to culture and refinement could shape a child's development in important ways. But Emma, even at 18 months old, seemed most content when playing with simple objects, exploring the world through direct experience rather than formal instruction, and spending time with adults who were fully present rather than distracted by agendas about appropriate development or social positioning. Jonathan and I had made deliberate choices about how to raise Emma that reflected what we had learned from Elena's example and from our foundation work about the importance of teaching children to value character over status, substance over appearance, and authentic relationships over social positioning. Emma's nursery contained books in multiple languages, including Polish, reflecting our commitment to honoring the linguistic heritage that Elena had been forced to abandon when she immigrated to America. We had also made connections with other families whose children were growing up with similar mixed heritage stories, creating a community where Emma could develop relationships with people who understood the complexity of carrying multiple cultural legacies. But perhaps the most significant change in our approach to raising Emma was our decision to tell her Elena's and Clara's story from the beginning, rather than waiting until she was older to share the complex truths about her family's history. We had learned from our foundation work that children are capable of understanding moral complexity much earlier than adults often assume, and that providing age-appropriate information about difficult historical topics can help children develop resilience and empathy, rather than anxiety or confusion. Emma's nursery contained a photograph of Elena and Clara together in Vienna, along with pictures of Elena at various stages of her life in America, and images from the Foundation's work documenting similar stories of preservation and courage. When Emma was old enough to ask questions about these photographs, we would be ready to explain how two young women's friendship had created a legacy that continued to influence our family's understanding of responsibility and trust decades after both women had died. The Foundation's success had also created opportunities that Jonathan and I had never anticipated when we first learned about Elena's ring. We had been invited to speak at conferences about refugee experiences, immigrant contributions to American society, and the ethical complexities of recovering and preserving cultural artifacts that had been displaced by historical traumas. These speaking engagements had connected us with scholars, activists, and community leaders, whose work was addressing similar questions about historical preservation and social justice. One particularly meaningful collaboration had developed with a group of educators who were creating curriculum materials about immigrant experiences for elementary and middle school students. My background as a third-grade teacher had proven valuable in helping design activities that could help young students understand complex historical topics without becoming overwhelmed by the magnitude of human suffering that characterized events like the Holocaust. The curriculum we were developing used Elena's and Clara's story as a case study in friendship, trust, and moral decision-making, encouraging students to think about how they might respond if faced with similar choices about protecting other people's precious possessions or preserving important stories. The exercises we created challenged students to consider questions about fairness, responsibility, and the difference between ownership and stewardship that were relevant to their own experiences, while also introducing them to historical topics that might otherwise seem distant or abstract. Working on these educational materials had reinforced my appreciation for Elena's decision to become a teacher later in her life, after her children were grown, and she had more flexibility to pursue work that aligned with her values, rather than simply providing financial stability. Elena had spent her final working years as a substitute teacher in Millbrook's elementary schools, where she had been beloved by students who appreciated her patient attention and her ability to explain complex concepts in ways that made sense to young minds. Several of Elena's former students had contacted the Foundation after learning about our work through media coverage of the symposium, sharing memories of a teacher who had encouraged them to ask questions about their own family histories and to treat the stories of older relatives with respect and curiosity. These memories had revealed that Elena's commitment to preserving Clara's story had extended into her professional work, where she had encouraged children to value the experiences and wisdom of previous generations, even when those experiences didn't align with contemporary expectations about success or social mobility. Emma's presence in Dr. Hartwell's office that afternoon represented the continuation of this legacy in ways that were both intentional and natural. She was growing up in an environment where questions about history, morality, and cultural preservation were part of regular family conversation, where museum visits and research activities were normal rather than special occasions, and where the adults in her life modeled curiosity and respect for stories that might initially seem distant from their own experiences. But Emma was also growing up with advantages that Elena and Clara could never have imagined, with access to resources and opportunities that reflected not just her family's financial security, but also the social progress that had occurred in the decades since Elena had first arrived in America, carrying Clara's ring, and the weight of promises she intended to keep. Emma would never have to choose between honoring her heritage and pursuing her dreams, between preserving family stories and building new traditions, between maintaining connections to the past and embracing possibilities for the future. As we prepared to leave the museum that afternoon, Dr. Hartwell handed me a folder containing the preliminary research she had completed on the silver bracelet that represented our foundation's newest case. The bracelet's story was still emerging, but early evidence suggested connections to a family of musicians who had fled Poland in 1939, carrying instruments and sheet music that had been preserved by relatives who had immigrated to America decades earlier. This could be the beginning of another significant discovery, Dr. Hartwell said, her voice carrying the same excitement I remembered from our first meeting about Elena's ring. The markings on the bracelet are consistent with pieces that were made for professional musicians, and the family remembers that their grandmother hummed melodies that they never heard anywhere else. If the sheet music still exists, we might be looking at compositions that were thought to be lost forever. The possibility of recovering lost musical compositions added another dimension to our foundation's work, expanding our focus beyond jewelry and artwork to include other forms of cultural expression that refugees had carried across oceans and through decades of silence. Music, like the stories we had been documenting, had the power to connect people across time and geography, to preserve emotions and experiences that could not be captured in words alone. Emma fell asleep in her car seat during the drive home from the museum, her tiny hand still clutching a small toy that Rachel had brought her from a recent trip to Israel. The toy was a replica of a traditional Eastern European doll, the kind that Clara might have played with as a child in Vienna, before the war changed everything about her family's circumstances and expectations. Emma would grow up understanding that this doll represented not just a different culture, but also a different historical moment, when children's games and adult responsibilities existed in a world that could be transformed overnight by forces beyond anyone's control. That evening, as Jonathan and I put Emma to bed in the nursery that contained photographs of Elena and Clara alongside pictures of our own wedding and Emma's birth, I found myself thinking about the circular nature of the legacy that Elena had entrusted to me. Elena had preserved Clara's ring until she could pass it to someone who would continue making good decisions about its significance. Clara had given Elena the ring, trusting that her friend would honor the memory it represented even if circumstances made it impossible to return the ring to its original family. Now Emma would grow up knowing that she carried forward the story of two young women whose friendship had transcended the circumstances that might have separated them, whose trust in each other had created a legacy that continued to inspire people decades after both women had died. Emma would understand that some gifts are more valuable than money, that some responsibilities are more important than personal convenience, and that some stories are worth preserving even when doing so requires sacrifice. The Foundation's work would continue long after Jonathan and I were no longer able to manage its daily operations. We had established endowments and partnerships that would ensure funding for research, education, and preservation activities for decades to come. We had trained other volunteers and staff members who understood the moral principles that guided our approach to recovering and documenting displaced cultural artifacts. Most importantly, we had created systems that would allow families to continue discovering and sharing stories about their own ancestors' experiences as refugees, immigrants, and carriers of other people's precious possessions. But the most significant aspect of Elena's legacy was not the Foundation's institutional success or the media attention that our work had received. The most significant aspect was the way that understanding Elena's choices had changed how Jonathan and I approached our own decisions about what mattered and what didn't, about which relationships deserved our energy, and which expectations deserved our accommodation. Emma would grow up in a family where moral courage was valued more than social status, where keeping promises was considered more important than avoiding difficult conversations, and where the experiences of people who had been historically marginalized were treated as sources of wisdom, rather than subjects for pity or condescension. She would understand that true wealth came from being trusted with other people's stories, that real sophistication meant recognizing value even when it didn't conform to conventional expectations, and that the most reliable indicator of character was how people treated responsibilities that no one else knew they carried. As I tucked Elena's ring into the jewelry box where I kept it safe each night, I thought about the conversation I would have with Emma someday, about the choices she might face when it came time for her to decide what to do with the legacy that Elena and Clara had created together. Emma would have options that Elena had never possessed, resources that Clara had lost before she could use them, and opportunities that neither woman could have imagined when they were young friends in Vienna, making promises they intended to keep regardless of what circumstances might require. But Emma would also have the responsibility that came with understanding the full significance of what had been entrusted to her family's care. She would need to decide how to honor the memory of two women she had never met, while building a life that reflected her own values and priorities. She would need to balance preservation of the past with engagement with the future, respect for previous generations' sacrifices with pursuit of her own dreams and ambitions. The Foundation's work had shown me that these kinds of decisions were not unique to our family's situation. Across the country and around the world, people were grappling with similar questions about how to honor complex family histories while building meaningful contemporary lives. The specific circumstances varied, but the fundamental challenge remained constant: how to carry forward the best of what previous generations had preserved, while adapting to changed conditions that previous generations could never have anticipated. Elena had faced this challenge when she decided to honor Clara's trust while building a new life in America that bore no visible resemblance to the circumstances that had brought the two women together in Vienna. Clara had faced it when she chose to trust a household servant with precious family heirlooms, rather than attempting to carry them herself into an uncertain future. Now Emma would face it when she inherited not just Elena's ring, but also the responsibility for continuing the story that Elena and Clara had begun together. The beauty of Elena's approach to these challenges was that she had never tried to make decisions for future generations about what they should value or how they should honor the past. Instead, she had modeled principles about trustworthiness, courage, and moral responsibility that could be applied to whatever circumstances future generations might encounter. She had preserved not just Clara's ring but also the story of why the ring mattered, leaving it to her granddaughter and great-granddaughter to decide how that story should continue. Standing in Emma's nursery that night, surrounded by photographs and artifacts that represented multiple generations of women who had made difficult choices about what to preserve and what to sacrifice, I felt the weight of continuing a legacy that had shaped my understanding of what it meant to be trusted with something precious. Elena's ring would always be valuable as a piece of jewelry, but its true significance lay in what it represented about the capacity of ordinary people to preserve extraordinary things through extraordinary circumstances. Emma would grow up knowing that she carried forward not just a beautiful piece of jewelry, but also a story about friendship, sacrifice, and the ways that individual choices could honor collective memory across decades and continents. She would understand that some gifts were more valuable than money, that some responsibilities were more important than personal convenience, and that some stories were worth preserving even when doing so required courage that most people would never have to demonstrate. The legacy that Elena and Clara had created together would continue as long as people were willing to carry it forward, to tell their story, and to apply their example to whatever moral challenges future generations might face. Emma would be part of that continuation, but she would also be free to interpret their legacy in ways that reflected her own understanding of what it meant to be trustworthy, courageous, and committed to preserving the things that mattered most. 5 years had passed since Emma's first visit to Dr. Hartwell's office, and now my daughter stood confidently beside the museum's new permanent exhibit dedicated to immigrant stories and displaced cultural artifacts. At 6 years old, Emma possessed a remarkable understanding of complex historical concepts, speaking easily about preservation, cultural heritage, and the moral responsibilities that came with being entrusted with other people's precious possessions. She wore Elena's ring on a specially designed child-safe chain, and she could explain to visitors why the ring was important, not just because it was valuable, but because it represented a friendship that had survived circumstances that destroyed so many other connections. The exhibit had been designed in collaboration with the Kowalski-Rothenberg Foundation and featured Elena's ring as the centerpiece of a larger display about objects that refugees had carried across oceans and through decades of silence. Visitors could listen to recorded interviews with families who had discovered similar treasures among their ancestors' possessions, read letters and documents that explained the historical context that had separated people from their belongings, and participate in interactive activities that challenged them to consider what they might choose to preserve if forced to leave everything else behind. Emma's favorite part of the exhibit was a recreation of Elena's small apartment in Millbrook, Ohio, complete with the kitchen table where Elena had taught her children to do homework, and the simple bedroom where she had kept Clara's ring in a wooden box beside her bed. The recreation helped visitors understand that Elena's decision to preserve something valuable while living in poverty had been made not once, but every single day for more than 4 decades. Each time she chose to honor her promise to Clara, rather than use the ring to improve her own family's circumstances. Jonathan had become the museum's unofficial expert on the ethical complexities of recovering displaced cultural artifacts, and his legal background had proven invaluable in helping other institutions navigate questions about ownership, provenance, and the appropriate ways to honor both the people who had originally owned precious objects and the people who had preserved them through difficult circumstances. His work had expanded beyond individual family cases to include larger questions about institutional responsibility, reparations, and the ways that museums could acknowledge historical injustices while still maintaining their educational missions. The success of our foundation's work had attracted attention from international organizations dedicated to recovering cultural artifacts that had been displaced by various conflicts and upheavals throughout history. We had been invited to consult on cases involving artwork stolen during various wars, musical instruments that had been separated from their makers during political upheavals, and family documents that had been preserved by people who understood their historical significance, even when they couldn't read the languages in which those documents had been written. Each new case reinforced our understanding that Elena's story was part of a much larger pattern of ordinary people making extraordinary choices about what to preserve and what to sacrifice during times of crisis. The Foundation's research had documented hundreds of similar stories, creating an archive that scholars and educators could use to help people understand the human dimensions of historical events that were often discussed only in terms of large-scale political and economic forces. Emma's presence at these research sessions had provided unexpected insights into how children process complex moral questions. Her questions about fairness, ownership, and the difference between keeping something safe and taking something that didn't belong to you had helped us refine our educational materials and develop more effective ways of explaining difficult concepts to young audiences. Emma's perspective had also reminded us that children are often more willing than adults to accept complexity and ambiguity, more comfortable with stories that don't have simple solutions or clear heroes and villains. The Hayes family's relationship with our work had evolved in ways that reflected their gradual understanding of how fundamentally their assumptions about value, worth, and respectability had been challenged by the revelation of Elena's ring's true significance. Margaret had become one of the Foundation's most generous supporters, though her contributions seemed motivated more by a desire to associate herself with our success than by genuine understanding of the principles that guided our work. Victoria had maintained a more distant relationship with our activities, occasionally attending public events but rarely engaging with the deeper questions about social justice and historical preservation that had become central to our mission. William, surprisingly, had become genuinely interested in the legal and ethical questions raised by our research, and his expertise in estate law had proven valuable in helping families navigate the complex process of determining ownership when valuable objects surfaced decades after their original owners had died. His involvement had also helped Jonathan understand that it was possible to challenge family expectations while still maintaining relationships based on mutual respect and shared intellectual interests. But the most significant change in the Hayes family dynamics had come from Emma's relationship with her grandparents, which had developed entirely outside the framework of social expectations and appropriate behavior that had characterized their interactions with me. Emma approached her grandparents with the same direct curiosity she brought to everything else in her world, asking questions about their childhoods, their memories of their own grandparents, and their understanding of what it meant to preserve family stories for future generations. These conversations had revealed aspects of the Hayes family history that had been obscured by decades of emphasis on social achievement and financial success. Margaret's own grandmother had been an Irish immigrant who had worked as a seamstress before marrying into the family that eventually became the foundation of the Hayes dynasty. William's grandfather had started as a laborer in the textile mills, before developing the business connections that allowed him to become an investor and eventually an owner. Learning about these earlier generations had helped Emma understand that all families carried stories about immigration, economic struggle, and the complex choices that previous generations had made about what to preserve and what to leave behind. The difference was not that some families had more dignified histories than others, but that some families had been more successful at transforming their stories into narratives about inevitable progress and natural superiority. Emma's questions had also forced Margaret and William to confront the ways their own emphasis on social positioning had sometimes prevented them from fully appreciating the experiences and wisdom of their own ancestors. The seamstress and the mill worker whose struggles had created the foundation for later family success had been honored primarily for their contribution to upward mobility, rather than for their individual characters or the specific challenges they had overcome. This recognition had created space for more honest conversations about the ways that class prejudice and cultural assumptions had shaped the Hayes family's initial treatment of Elena's memory, and my choice to honor her legacy through wearing her ring. Margaret's apologies for years of subtle condescension had been genuine, though they had also revealed how little she had understood about the impact of her attitudes and expectations on my sense of belonging within the family. The Foundation's work had also connected us with other families, whose discoveries about their ancestors' hidden treasures had forced them to reconsider their understanding of family history and cultural identity. We had worked with a family in California whose grandmother had preserved a collection of Japanese ceramics through the internment camps of World War II, maintaining the fiction that they were worthless reproductions, while actually protecting pieces that had been in her family for generations. We had collaborated with descendants of a family in New Mexico whose great-grandfather had carried silver jewelry made by Native American artisans through decades of discrimination and legal restrictions on Native cultural practices, preserving techniques and designs that might otherwise have been lost during periods when expressing Native identity was dangerous or illegal. Each of these cases had reinforced our understanding that the preservation of cultural artifacts was often inseparable from questions about survival, resistance, and the complex decisions that marginalized communities had been forced to make about when to hide their heritage and when to display it publicly. The objects themselves were important, but the stories about why and how they had been preserved were equally valuable as historical documentation and moral instruction. Emma's education had been shaped by exposure to these various stories, creating a foundation for understanding cultural diversity and historical complexity that most children her age never had the opportunity to develop. She spoke easily about different immigration experiences, various forms of persecution and resistance, and the ways that individual families' choices had contributed to larger patterns of cultural preservation and adaptation. But perhaps more importantly, Emma was learning to think about moral responsibility in ways that extended beyond simple rules about right and wrong, to include more nuanced questions about fairness, justice, and the obligations that came with privilege and opportunity. Her questions about why some families had been able to preserve their treasures openly while others had been forced to hide them had led to conversations about discrimination, economic inequality, and the ongoing effects of historical injustices on contemporary communities. These conversations had prepared Emma to understand that inheriting Elena's ring meant more than simply receiving a valuable piece of jewelry. It meant accepting responsibility for continuing to tell Elena's and Clara's story in ways that honored their friendship, while also contributing to broader efforts to document and preserve similar stories that might otherwise be forgotten or dismissed. The Foundation's educational programs had expanded to include partnerships with schools, community organizations, and other museums interested in developing more inclusive approaches to teaching history and cultural studies. Our curriculum materials were being used in classrooms across the country to help students understand immigration experiences, refugee resettlement, and the ways that ordinary people had preserved important cultural traditions through extraordinary circumstances. Emma had become an unofficial spokesperson for these educational efforts, participating in presentations and discussions with a confidence that reflected her deep understanding of the subject matter and her natural comfort with public speaking. Her ability to explain complex concepts in language that other children could understand had made her particularly effective at peer-to-peer education, helping other young people understand why these historical stories mattered for their own lives and communities. The success of our educational work had also created opportunities for Emma to travel and meet other families whose ancestors had faced similar challenges about preserving cultural heritage while adapting to new circumstances. These encounters had reinforced her understanding that Elena's story was part of a much larger human experience of displacement, preservation, and the courage required to maintain connections to the past while building meaningful futures. One particularly memorable trip had taken us to Montreal, where we met with a family whose grandfather had preserved French-Canadian folk songs through decades of linguistic discrimination, teaching them quietly to his children and grandchildren, while publicly encouraging them to assimilate into English-speaking Canadian society. The family's decision to record and publish these songs after their grandfather's death had contributed to a revival of interest in French-Canadian cultural traditions, and had helped younger generations reconnect with aspects of their heritage that had nearly been lost. Emma's conversations with the children in this family had revealed her sophisticated understanding of the ways that cultural preservation sometimes required temporary sacrifice, that protecting important traditions might mean hiding them for periods when public expression would be dangerous or disadvantageous. She had also demonstrated her ability to recognize the courage required for previous generations to make these difficult choices, often without knowing whether future generations would appreciate or understand their sacrifices. As we prepared for the Foundation's 5th annual symposium, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed since that first afternoon when I had walked into Romano's fine jewelry hoping to learn something about Elena's ring that might help me defend my choice to continue wearing it. The woman who had been so desperate for the Hayes family's approval that she had considered having Elena's ring reset or replaced had been transformed into someone who understood that the most important approval came from living according to principles that honored the best examples set by previous generations. Emma's participation in this symposium planning had added perspectives that none of the adult organizers had considered, particularly regarding how to make historical content accessible and engaging for younger audiences without oversimplifying the moral complexities that made these stories worth preserving. Her suggestions had led to the inclusion of interactive activities and creative projects that allowed children to explore questions about friendship, loyalty, and cultural preservation through art, music, and storytelling. The symposium itself had become a celebration not just of Elena's and Clara's story, but of the broader community of people who had been inspired by their example to investigate their own family histories, share stories that had been hidden for decades, and commit to preserving cultural traditions that might otherwise be forgotten. The event drew participants from across North America and included presentations by scholars, activists, and community members whose work addressed various aspects of immigration, cultural preservation, and historical justice. Emma's presentation at the symposium, delivered with the confidence of someone who had been thinking about these issues for most of her young life, focused on what children could learn from stories about friendship and trust that had survived difficult historical circumstances. Her talk included examples from Elena's and Clara's experience, as well as from other cases the Foundation had documented, demonstrating her ability to identify common themes and moral lessons that transcended specific cultural and historical contexts. Watching Emma speak to an audience of adults who listened to her insights with genuine respect and interest, I realized that Elena's legacy had achieved something that went beyond the preservation of a single piece of jewelry, or even the documentation of a particular historical experience. Elena's example had created a framework for thinking about moral responsibility, cultural preservation, and intergenerational trust that could be applied to whatever challenges future generations might face. Emma would grow up understanding that some gifts were more valuable than money, that some responsibilities were more important than personal convenience, and that some stories were worth preserving even when doing so required courage that most people would never have to demonstrate. But she would also grow up with resources and opportunities that would allow her to apply these principles in ways that reflected her own interests, talents, and understanding of how to contribute to her community and the broader world. The Foundation's work would continue long after Emma inherited full responsibility for Elena's ring and the story it represented. But the most important aspect of Elena's legacy was not any particular institution or program, but rather the example she had set about how to carry other people's precious possessions with dignity, how to honor commitments that no one else knew existed, and how to make decisions based on principles rather than convenience or social pressure. As I tucked Emma into bed that night after the symposium, she asked me the same question she had been asking for months about when she would be old enough to wear Elena's ring on her finger rather than around her neck. My answer had evolved as Emma had grown and demonstrated her understanding of what the ring represented, but the core message remained consistent. She would be ready to wear the ring when she fully understood that its value came not from its monetary worth, but from her commitment to continuing the story of friendship and trust that Elena and Clara had begun together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.